I think we have everybody in here that is joining us. So I just wanted to kind of introduce you to everyone here. If hopefully you just didn't wander in, but you're here for the journalism in the time of COVID, ethics, safety, and self-care. And just a little bit of background on Tom before I turn things over to him. Tom is a longtime friend of journalist James Foley and serves as the Education Program Director for the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation. In addition, he is the Research and Grant Coordinator at Marquette University's Center for Peacemaking, as well as a lecturer in both English and Peace Studies. In tonight's workshop, Tom will discuss James Foley's motivations, including Jim's view on moral courage when pursuing stories that highlighted underrepresented voices. Connecting this pursuit to our current environment, Tom will also emphasize the importance of safety and self-care. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you guys for taking time on a Wednesday night to join me. I know it's a little bit late out there. It's just past 9 where you guys are at, most of you.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we're here in the Great Midwest. We're only at 8 o'clock, so we got a long night ahead of us. But thank you, and I want to thank you, Jim, and the Reed College for having the Foley Foundation. It means a lot for us to be part of these events, to share our safety modules, but also just to reach out. It looks like we have some students, at least a few students that I can see faces of. And we're just honored to be part of this and to help promote journalism safety, especially like when you listen to what the panelists were saying, how important journalism is right now and how much we need young journalists. And so in a second, I'm going to give you an outline, and then I'll share a PowerPoint. But I really want to emphasize that when we're talking about safety, at least from our perspective of the Foley Foundation, we view it as safety as empowering, not something to be frightened of. It's something that, like, all right, the more I know about safety, the more confident I should be or can be in terms of pursuing stories, knowing what your boundaries are, what you're capable of doing. So we really view safety as one, as Diane mentioned, a skill set, but one that should empower you to feel safe. And so in terms of what I'm hoping to do today is I'm going to share a little bit about the safety modules, how they were created, and the topics we cover, because again, they are available. They're available to instructors. They're also available to students who are just looking for information about certain topics, or freelancers or news organizations. And then after sharing some of that, I want to share some of Jim's background and his motivations, because I really believe that Jim's motivations for being a journalist, which he didn't come to until later in life, or in his 30s, can help us think through why it's so important and what the role of the journalist is now, especially during these times. There's a pandemic, there are protests, the press is under attack, as David Scribner was mentioned, in ways we've never seen before. But they're also needed in ways we've never seen before. And then from there, I'll share some information from our modules. And what I'm going to focus on tonight is physical and emotional safety and self-care, including some of the questions that we address in our safety modules. And I'd like to leave about 20 minutes or so, because while I'm a good talker, I'm not the best lecturer. I get tired of hearing myself. Most of my students, when I'm in class, get tired of hearing from me as well. So my hope is to leave about 20 minutes or so we can have a conversation or Q&A if people have questions. So if I can share my screen.
You should be able to.
Okay, let me see if I can do this. I was practicing earlier today. I'm probably one of the rare professors right now that has yet to do an online class, because at Marquette, we're still in person. So are you able to see a slide?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So this is there's a website there for the James W. Foley journalism safety modules. And the safety modules, Diane alluded to this, they were born out of Ellen Scherer, who is a bureau chief at Medill in Washington, D.C. was one of Jim's professors when Jim Foley was a graduate student at Northwestern. And after Jim's death, she created these graduate level seminars they're very rich. They're very robust. They're 3 to 4 hour seminars. There's 5 of them, but they're really geared towards a graduate level student. And what was happening is Diane and I were traveling. We'd gone to Indiana University. I had been out to Weber State, a few other schools, and we were hearing from students and instructors that they needed something that could be incorporated into their programs, but they weren't looking for a new course. And at the undergraduate level, we were already thinking to ourselves, like, how would you create a safety course? Like, would you teach it freshman year? Would you wait till junior or senior year? Like, when would this even be introduced? And so it was while Diane was actually visiting Marquette in December of 2018, and she was a guest of the Center for Peacemaking. We stopped by the journalism department and said, hey, we got this idea about doing these modules that can be incorporated into existing courses. So professors didn't have to change a course they were already teaching. They didn't have to create a new course. What they could do is, in introductory courses, they can introduce something about safety. In later courses that they're talking about interviewing, you talk about hostile sources. And we viewed it as kind of a way that students throughout their undergraduate career would be learning elements of safety as it relates to the profession, without it being like hammered, like hammering down, like this is about safety, to where it becomes almost, this is just part of learning to be a journalist. And the way I always think about it, and the way we approach this, is journalists are first responders. They're on the scene before other people on the scene. I always compare it to my sister. My sister is an ambulance chief with the Chicago Fire Department, and her job is to save lives. So she goes wherever they want her to go, and she tries to save a life. If they totally ignore the fact that she's going to go into neighborhoods she doesn't know, where other things after following a shooting, and they didn't teach her safety, they'd be derelict in their duty in terms of training her to be a paramedic. In the same way, I think with journalists, they need to know that besides being a good journalist and getting the story and being ethical, they need to know safety and how do I do this safely? What are the steps I take? And we felt that there was no better time to introduce that than at the undergraduate level, when students are learning and they can start building these habits. They can start applying them. And so we came up with these safety modules, and we have 14 safety modules. The most recent updates have occurred in the last couple months following, well, the pandemic, and then with the protests following the George Floyd killing. So we have the overview of the safety modules. These are the topics we cover. Obviously we're not covering them all tonight, but we have Intro to Journalism Safety. At Marquette, where we piloted the program, on the first day that students walk into into their first class, they receive a business card that ends up going in their lanyard. And the business card on the front side, it says, "Be safe. Before everything, stop, assess, focus, and act." On the back side, they have the number for the Marquette University Police Department. They have the number for their editor's desk, and they have a number for a counseling center. So from the very first moment they're in the program, we want them to be thinking about safety as part of it, who they are as a journalist. Then we talk about developing safe habits. There's running a newsroom, on what to do on assignment, reporting during COVID, which that's our most recent, along with journalists' rights. That was our most recent module, and it's become there's no way around it. Everything is about COVID. We're working in a pandemic, so that always has to be the forefront of our thinking. There's diversity in the newsroom, and this goes back to what Michelle Ferrier was talking about, like journalists of color, women journalists, in terms of their safety and the fact that they're targeted more specifically and with more vitriol than their male colleagues. So we delve into that. There's self-care. I think this is something that for a long time was ignored in some ways in the journalism field, based on the people we've talked to, in terms of when you work on a story, you become part of that story. You absorb trauma, and it's all right to feel that weight and acknowledge that you feel that weight. Online harassment, which David was talking about, and Michelle as well, protecting sources, working with hostile sources, digital security, covering foreign conflicts and natural disaster and weather-related events. These are all topics that are covered in the modules. Obviously, we're not going through all those, but if you had any interest in these topics, you can always go to our website and find them and have access to them. Okay, so understanding Jim's background and motivation. In talking about Jim's background and motivation, I think it's important for me to point out that I, like Diane, and I don't come from a journalist background. I spent 2 years freelancing in graduate school. Like I'm an English professor. I work in peace studies. I was brought into journalism safety because of Jim, because of my friendship. Um, so I rely on experts. I view myself in terms of what I can share more as a researcher and a compiler of useful information that can be used by journalists. I don't profess to be an expert in journalism, so I just want to make that clear starting off. But in terms of Jim Foley, I think his motivations can serve, and his legacy can serve as a very useful tool for thinking about the importance of journalism, especially in this day. So I was very fortunate. The first week I walked on Marquette's campus back in 1992, I met Jim Foley. Marquette's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was coming from Chicago, 90 miles south. I thought I knew everything. And I meet this guy from some small town in New Hampshire, like wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, like just looking around, and like I mean, it was like they get dropped in from another planet. But he also is a super interesting guy, and this guy that wanted to visit any new neighborhood he could visit, any new restaurant he could go to. Bobby Seale comes from the Black Panthers, comes to talk on campus. He's like, we got to go see this guy talk. So he's a good guy to hitch your wagon to learn new things, and so that's what I did. He was also interesting in other ways. Like even in college, like when spring breaks would roll around, most of us would be looking for some warm place to go to hang out for a week. He would do the MAP program, which was Marquette Action Program, where he'd go. I know he went to South Dakota, he went to Mississippi, building houses, serving in underrepresented or underserved communities. And it's really where I got the first inkling, like this person really is interested in people. And I think that is one of the keys for a good journalist. You have to really truly be interested in the people you're writing about and the stories that you're covering. And that ties into ethics in terms of like, what is your motivation for doing this? And Jim's motivation was always to learn more about people. Following college, I went off to grad school. Jim went to do Teach for America. If you're familiar with Teach for America, it's usually a 2-year program. He did two years in Central Phoenix and stayed on for a third. He worked in Central Phoenix, mostly Hispanic kids. He thought he was a terrible teacher. Later in life, we found out that he was still in contact with over like 15 kids that he taught way back then, that were still viewing him as a mentor, still looked up to him, and he was still counseling them and working with them. So I think that gets back to his interest in people. He went, after Teach for America, he went to UMass, where he did a creative writing MFA. While he's at UMass, Jim, who never likes to be the center of the story, writes a short story about his Teach for America experience. And the central character is a hapless teacher named James Foley. And this short story about these kids and they're growing up and trying to understand them wins the 2002 Indiana Review Award for short fiction. And upon winning that award, we find out, we don't find out about it. He doesn't tell a soul. One of our friends is flipping through the Indiana Review and finds the story and asks him about it. He goes, oh yeah, I won this story. I won this award for this story. So I think, and this, again, this ties in journalism, he was always trying to hone his craft as a storyteller. He was trying to be the best writer he could be, to get the story right. From UMass, he goes to the Cook County Boot Camp, which is where he works for 2.5 years working with convicted felons aged 17 to 24, largely African American, Hispanic American, and he gets really invested in their stories. And I think right then is when he had, I don't know what you want to call it, an epiphany, but it's where he realized he didn't need to make up stories. He didn't need to be a fiction writer. There were stories that needed to be told, and they were out there. He had to go find them. And I think he felt it was his calling. His job was to find those stories and to share those. So he left the boot camp and went to Medill, did a year, the 4 quarters, and when he could have been done, he decided to do a 5th quarter in DC, where he was training to be a foreign correspondent. He realized he wanted to cover conflict. It doesn't surprise me that that's what his interests were. He was always adventurous. He was always looking for places to go, different stories. He had a high risk tolerance, for better or worse. And as I was mentioning, he was always honing his writing craft. And at that point, he started working more on his photography and video journalism, and really working to be the best he could be at those 2 skills. The thing that he did best, though, and I think this is important, especially for young journalists, Jim Foley was the absolute best listener I've ever met in my life, ever. You could talk to him for an hour, and it wasn't until you got to the end that you realized he was interviewing you, he was trying to learn about you, he cared about what you were saying, and you got nothing out of him. The story, it was about you. It was about the person across from him. And it's another thing, I think, when it comes to ethical journalism, you've got to be a good listener, actually a great listener. You have to know what people are saying. And I think, especially in this day and age, Jim was somebody who truly cared. And there's this, I feel like there's this, a lot of talk about this idea that you need to be objective in your journalism, which that's true, you should be objective. But being objective does not mean being dispassionate. You can care about your story. You don't, it's not a both sides type thing. If you're talking, if you're getting a story from somebody, you can care about it. Later on, we're going to talk about how that caring, though, that's where self-care comes in, because you become invested in the stories that you're trying to work on, that you're trying to get right. And so Jim's motivation was to get to the truth, and that's what journalism is about. It's to get to the truth. And in my opinion, we need more Jims. I meet a lot of young journalists, and I see more Jims. I see people that want to go out there, and I think for the older generation and for instructors, it's their job, our job, to make sure they can do this work safely. And I think it's important. The other thing I want to point out, and this again is for young journalists, Jim didn't just go one day to Libya or something like that. Like, it didn't just happen overnight. Like, when Jim finished at Medill, his first job was with the USAID, and he was in Baghdad in the Green Zone. And I can remember having calls with him and talking with him, and he was happy to be in Baghdad. He was happy to be starting to cover stories, but he also felt confined because he was within the Green Zone. He was walled in and he was protected. But it was a good first step. It was a transition to start to see what it's like to report overseas or in a new environment. After some time with USAID, he embedded with the Indiana National Guard in Afghanistan. This time he was able to get more into the field, but he still had the protection of the military. And this, for him, it proved to be a pro and a con. He felt like he couldn't get the real story because he was surrounded by military, but he was able to, I would say, like, advance his boundaries of what he was capable of doing. Following National Guard, he had a brief stint with Stars and Stripes, and then he went to Libya. to cover the Arab Spring, about 3 years, 2 or 3 years after his first arrival in Iraq. So there's a process involved. I talk to a lot of young journalists, like and they're like, I want to go overseas and I want to work, and I'm always like, that's a great goal, but you should still think about, what does it take to do that? What are the boundaries I have to work through, or the things I have to learn? Of course, when Jim was working in Libya, he had been there a few times. He was abducted once in Libya, and he was held for 44 days. He was released. When he came back, he worked behind a desk for about 6 months at Global Post, and you could tell that was not going to take. He was not going to work behind a desk for long, and he not too long after that, about 7 months, he returned to Libya. He was there for the fall of Gaddafi. And then later he went into Syria, and he visited Syria 3 or 4 times, and it was on his last trip when he was abducted. It was Thanksgiving of 2012. We didn't know if he was alive. We didn't know where he was at. He was held for 19 months, and then almost everyone knows, like, he was eventually beheaded by ISIS. He was the first person killed, and so that leads us into, like, why we believe in journalism safety. I don't want to dwell on Jim's passing. I think he has a legacy that we can further and that we can use to support young journalists. And it was in between Libya and Syria when I had a bunch of conversations with him, and I was trying to learn more about him. I'm like, why are you doing this? I remember I had one conversation where I'm like, when he was coming back from Syria, I'm like, what's it like in Syria? I'm like, it's crazy. I'm like, is it crazier than Libya? He's like, oh yeah, way crazier. I'm like, you got captured in Libya. Like, why would you go back? And he's like, he just had to. And so, in thinking about him, there's some quotes from Jim that really stand out to me. And it kind of goes, it arcs through his life. If you look at the top one, with Marquette, I went on some volunteer trips to South Dakota and Mississippi and learned I was a sheltered kid and the world had real problems. I think that's an important starting point, like, to thinking about what was his motivation. What are your motivations in terms of being a journalist? Jim realized that he had privilege. He came from a middle-class family. He never wanted for anything. He realized that his experience was not the experience of most, or at least others. And so he started looking at the world like, what needs to be done? What stories can I tell? How can I help people? Where do I fit into all this? The second quote, and this might be the one that I think is most important in terms of today. He says, I believe that frontline journalism is important. Without these photos and videos and firsthand experience, we can't really tell the world how bad it might be. And I remember talking to Jim about Frontlines. And Jim, when he started, the Frontline was the front line of war. Like, how close can you get to Gaddafi's troops? But over time, I started talking to him, and he started seeing that front lines aren't necessarily always at the war. They're in the communities or the people being affected by the war. And that those stories are just as important as the big bangs and the big booms and the bombs. And I'm convinced that if Jim was here today, he would say the front lines are when you walk outside your door. The front lines are everywhere, especially in this day and age, where there is a pandemic impacting everybody in our country in some way or another. All these people are fighting a war of some sort to survive, to get through, to deal with it. And frontline journalism has changed. And this came up in the panel, it's no longer that you go overseas to war to experience danger. And Jim, I'm a little upset with you because I'm going to come up on a U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, and I have all the exact same numbers that I have written down here that I was going to share about the 825 press incidents, about the arrests. But the front lines have moved. The front lines are here. That does not mean we need to be scared of them. It just means we need to be aware of them, that things are changing. And then lastly, Jim's last quote, and this is the quote that really drives the foundation. There's physical courage, but that's nothing compared to moral courage. If I don't have that moral courage, we don't have journalism. I thought David Scribner made an important point that we often overlook, because the people that are shouting fake news, that are pointing fingers, that are attacking the press, we sometimes don't realize the silent majority that depends on journalism, that need journalism. And in this day and age, when you see local journalism, a lot of it shutting down due to economic issues, student journalists are the local news. They're picking up that mantle and sharing that news. So I think it's important that we recognize that front lines are all around us, and that we are journalists are providing a service, are providing something that we desperately need in this time. Staying safe in the field, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. I strongly recommend, I am glad that Jim brought it up. This is something that journalists should visit. They should see, just to be aware of what's taking place in and around the country. I won't go through the numbers, because I have the same, honestly, I have the same exact numbers I've written down here. But I do think there's one other thing that's on the back of the business card that we provide our students, and it says, it's from the Society of Professional Journalists preamble. Ethical journalism strives to ensure the free exchange of information that is accurate, fair, and thorough. An ethical journalist acts with integrity. And at the end of the day, when Jim's talking about moral courage, he's talking about integrity. If I don't have the integrity to go out and seek the truth, despite what it might do to my career, to my ability to sell a story to an agency, if I don't have my integrity, then as a journalist, I'm not fulfilling my role. I need to have that. So this brings us, if we're going to be ethical journalists, if students are going to get out there and do it, you have to be safe. And the things I wanted to point out a few things that we really stress in our modules, and questions that have come up and that we really focus on. The first thing is risk assessments. That we want young journalists at a very early age to get in the habit of doing a risk assessment. What story are you covering? What time are you going? When are you coming back? Do you have a contact person? Have you thought about, Jim, you brought this up with the buddy system. Is someone going with you? How much equipment are you bringing? What equipment do you need? How are you dressed? Have you thought about the weather? Have you been to the place that you're going to before? These are things that journalists can get in the habit of doing, that then will just be part of how they work. And part of the reason this needs to be done is because the U.S. is becoming a more problematic place for journalists. It starts from the top down. There's clearly animosity between the Trump administration and the free press, and it's arguably greater than we've seen before. There's this blurring of the line between fact and opinion. I think, from my view, I think one of the problems that we're dealing with is media has become all-encompassing of a word, and journalists are not seen as any different than an opinion person on TV. They don't realize how much vetting goes on, how much resources are checked. So that makes it it makes it more dangerous, because the media is just being conflated into one monolithic thing that people can rail against. I would argue that trying to fight this idea of fake news is a useless endeavor. There's the people that are shouting it aren't looking to change. They're not looking to be convinced that you're not fake news. And so what we focus on is we want to make sure that journalists, especially young journalists, know what their rights are. So one of the questions we address is, do members of the press have same or different rights than the general public? And this is something that a journalist should know, but Mickey Osterreicher from the National Press Photographers Association, he writes, while photographing or recording in public, the press has no greater right of access than the public, but the press has no less right either. An example, photographing a newsworthy event, the press may not be kept farther away than the public, but the press is not entitled to be closer just because it is the press. Some places, such as California, have codified a greater access right for the press, but that is a statutory right, not a constitutional one. This goes back to risk assessment. Do you know where you're going? Do you know what the rules are? Is there a curfew in place? If a law enforcement person tells you to disperse, do you have to disperse? And typically the answer is yes. But you need to know what the laws are and what your rights are when covering a story, especially when we're seeing the lack of regard for someone saying I'm press or showing a press pass. You need to know your rights. One of the things that I was most happy about is we had a young Marquette student who was covering the protests in Milwaukee. This had to be about June 2nd. It was shortly after the George Floyd murder. And she was at one of our local parks, and she came across some other young journalists. And having had some of our safety training, she's like, I knew what we were supposed to do. I knew where to look in terms of where the police line was. I knew what we would do if tear gas was fired. And a lot of the other journalists followed me, because I was telling them this is what we need to do and this is how we should respond. And it's things like that that are going to help young journalists, particularly, is to know how to respond in certain situations, to have a plan in place as you're entering the situation. There's a technique that they use called kettling, where they try to take protesters and move them back to where they're bound in, and then rescue make. If a journalist is unaware, they can easily be caught in that type of situation. So that's where knowing your perimeter becomes something important. And again, I'm not a journalist, so I can't say I've experienced it. This is from talking to other journalists who've been in this situation. And again, this is something that you can read about, but I know until it happens, it's hard to figure out how to put in practice. But just thinking about it and going into what we would think safe situations are right now, and thinking about it can put you in the mindset for when you are in a situation where things maybe escalate quicker than you were expecting. So there's things of that nature, how you can take care of your physical safety. The other thing we're very concerned about, and this also comes from conversations I had with Jim. I know that when he came back from Libya and Syria the first couple of times, he was worn down. He was still the same guy, but you could just see something different about him. And so self-care is increasingly important. Again, we're working in a pandemic. Everything you're doing is being colored by this pandemic. You can't escape it. It's not like there's pandemic stories. Every story is essentially a pandemic story, because you have to be aware of this stuff. So there's things like vicarious stress, compassion stress, and this comes from working closely with people who have been in stressful situations. You are part of those stressful situations now. So there's some self-evaluations. Are you feeling exhaustion, procrastination, tears? Of course, we're all feeling those, but does it feel more severe? If you're a young newsroom editor, are you checking in on the people going out that are writing stories? Are you checking on when they come back? Are they okay? I think more than ever, we need a bond, a closeness between journalists, even that are in competition for stories. They still need to be checking in on each other. I can't remember who brought this up at the panel, but the other thing we talked about is there's coping strategies. And these are extremely important right now. One of the coping strategies, if you're feeling a little, if you're feeling the stress of the situation, is to prevent isolation. And we are in times that demand isolation. So how do you find someone that you can talk to so you don't feel alone? Is it do you understand the emotions that you feel are normal, that it's all right to feel this way? Are you practicing things like self-care, whether it's eating properly, relaxing? One of the big issues that's been coming up in a lot of articles, and not just for journalists, I'm not saying this, but there's a prevalence of drinking during the pandemic. That could exacerbate any problems you're feeling in terms of the stress of the job. And then just like this whole idea that you can do other activities, listen to music, take time away. I believe it was Michelle who was talking about, like, make the screen smaller, step away from your work for a while, do things that allow you to get through this, and thinking you just have to bull your way through difficult situations. It's not a sign of weakness to acknowledge that certain stories and events are impacting you. It's not. It goes back to, I think, what I was saying about Jim, that he cared enough about stories that they did impact him, and you can't just pretend like it's done because you filed the story. The story's still with you. So those are things that we talk about, and I already feel like I talked too long, and I would love to hear. I'm gonna put up one more slide just for people for later, but there are different resources that you can go to. Like, there are different places, but I think it starts at West Virginia, for instance. If your students there, being close together, talking to your professors, talking to your colleagues, making sure you're all looking out for each other. These are difficult times for everybody, but particularly for people that are working to get to the truth. So
Yeah, no, this is fabulous stuff. So thank you, Tom, for this. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to hop on and ask, or put it in the chat, anything that you can. I'll also mention too, on the self-care part of it, I think I kind of mentioned this in the panel discussion, but one area that I think a lot of newsrooms don't really pay attention to, I might say, when we consider the people who might be feeling the effects of covering a lot of these issues that are going on now, are the teams that are like the digital teams that are inside of newsrooms, where they are sitting at a desk, they're monitoring all of the social media chatter on stories, they're monitoring all the comments that come in on stories, they're monitoring all the feeds that are coming in with video or images of these stories. They're seeing all the different sources of text that are coming for these stories. And they're doing this on story after story after story. And that can really build some great internal pressures on a lot of the digital teams in newsrooms. And I've seen it in some of my colleagues when I worked at NBC in particular, when you're on a national team and you're dealing with tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, that really weighs heavy on a lot of digital team members. And I think they're kind of the quiet, overlooked people in the newsroom a lot of times. And I hope that we can all, as managers and other people in the newsroom, think about them as well. They're not going out and covering the story, but they're oftentimes seeing the most graphic details of some of these stories, and are seeing a lot of the talk about these stories too. And just wanted to mention that that's just one area that I think a lot of places should be paying attention to for that.
Yeah, it reminds me, there's one source where it talks about a journalist who they didn't even realize it. And I think this relates. He had covered 3 deaths in a row. And this is not COVID related, this is previous to that. But it's until he thought about it, I was like, oh my gosh, I just did this 3 times in a row. I need a break. And I think that what you're saying, Jim, about the digital teams is they might not even realize how much they're taking in. Because this is my job, this is what I'm doing. And that's not healthy. It's not like there has to be some pullbacks where you can like take a break from this barrage of negative, or whether it's images, words, whatever it might be, but like just to take a break from it.
Absolutely. I remember myself being on that national team and covering, mass shooting after mass shooting, whether it be in Vegas, whether it be in Orlando, whether it be here in Pittsburgh, you just name it. Elementary school shootings. All these just like again and again and again, and you realize after a while, you know how to cover them, and like everything that you need to look for to get that story, but you're also just exposing yourself to so much in those instances. And I guess, it is the same for anyone who's on like a breaking news beat or a police beat or anything of that nature. But the constant barrage of those images, or that, the video from those things can really take a toll. I know I had one of my coworkers at NBC who just had to quit one day, and that was like, she just couldn't do it anymore because of that. And so that's where we really realized that like we need to do a much better job at the self-care angle of it, and caring for each other in those newsrooms there.
That was like what David talking about, the survivor's guilt, and
Mm-hmm.
like just like to keep, especially if it happens multiple times, where you like, I'll be honest, I couldn't imagine like someone like having like covering like a school shooting, like something like that, and then just trying to be normal. Like, like you said, how to cover it, it's important, it needs to be covered, but then you go on. But what steps do you take to make sure you coped with that?
Right, absolutely. Um, so I just want to open up again. Anyone else have any questions, comments, anything that they want to share?
Jim,
Yeah.
one thing Bill and I were just talking about here is, I think for the young people, you got to find a hobby too. When you're away from work, turn the phone off. Put the iPad away and do yard work. For me, home, work on my house is very therapeutic. You've got to separate from your job, when you can, because it does build up, and it's just, it used to be at the end of the day you went home and you didn't really have to worry about it till the next day, and now it's with you all the time with a device, and you've got to just learn how to put it away and give yourself just time for yourself. It's very important.
Absolutely. Great point. Yeah. And it's harder to do now too, when we all have remote offices, and we can just hop on and start working from wherever we are. And it is hard to do, but there are times when you just got to say, I gotta put down the Twitter for a bit, and kind of take a deep breath and just relax and do something else. Yeah.
Yeah, and building on that, I feel it, even like in any profession now, working from home, like you're always working, because you can always get to your laptop, you can always get on your phone, and you have to, like, luckily I have a wife that every once in a while is like, you need to come downstairs, like you've been upstairs for like 9 straight hours in that office. I'm like, I got to get this done. It's like, just come eat, like just, you need to take a break. And it's hard because you're like, you don't have that office to go to and then the office to leave for a lot of people right now. And there's a sense that if I have time, I should be doing something, and that something can't always be work. It's got to be like, I agree, like whether it's yard work, a hobby, something that's not work related.
Absolutely. Any other questions, thoughts? Now we have some students on here, so. No. Okay. Well, Tom, any last words that you'd like to share with everybody here?
No, well, yes, with the students, I want you to, I'm not saying this lightly, I truly admire students that are going into this profession, because we need it, and because it's noble, but because I admire that despite what it sounds like is an echo chamber of anger or vitriol or just these bad things with the press, that you believe in it, because we need journalists. We need people that are willing to dig for stories, to work for stories, to tell the stories. It's what a democracy is. If we don't have a free press, we don't have young people that believe that it's worthwhile. I don't think we're around for much longer. So I think it's really impressive when I go to schools and get to see how many young people still they're not deterred. They believe in what they're doing, and they're excited to get out there. And there's probably never been a greater time to be a journalist, in the sense of that there are stories out there, and that you're needed. It might not feel like that at times, I know, but it's like being an English major, an English professor. Like, people will tell you they appreciate you. It's not necessarily in your paycheck, and it's not necessarily from everyone who talks to you, but it's a valued thing, and I really do appreciate young people being brave enough and bold enough to get into this.
Absolutely, absolutely, and just hearing every once in a while those thank you emails or thank you notes that people still send to journalists, that kind of makes it all worthwhile. And especially, all the work that we do to help others, and to see what our work can do for others really makes us keep going at times through all the hard times. So Tom, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for joining us here. Hopefully this was very helpful for you, and you can see all the resources there that Tom has shared. And you can go to the James Foley Foundation website as well, I'm sure, to check out all the modules and everything else they have there. So once again, thank you, and to thank Ogden Newspaper Seminar Series for helping us host this. So thank you all, and have a good night. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.